because I can't read it.
Thanks so much everyone for coming. This talk is run under the auspices of the Global Priorities Institute, a relatively new research institute that was established here in Oxford in 2018, just last year. GPI exists to conduct and to promote academic research into issues that arise in the context of thinking about the question of what we should do with a fixed amount of resources, insofar as our aim is to do the most possible good with those resources. The thing about the resource pot being constrained, being finite, is of course crucial because there are many problems in the world. If we had infinite resources, we could solve all of them. But since we have finite resources, we have to think carefully about how to prioritize between the different problems that we could try to take on. This enterprise draws naturally on central themes both in economics and in philosophy, so GPI is an interdisciplinary institute involving at the moment mostly those two academic disciplines. The aim of this Parfit Memorial Lecture series is to focus specifically on the philosophy side and to exhibit and to encourage academic philosophy research into this enterprise that we call Global Priorities Research. We also run a counterpart Memorial Lecture series in economics. That's the Atkinson Memorial Lecture series. And this year's Atkinson Lecture, for those of you who are interested in that, will be also in this building on June the 11th. The name of Derek Parfit will, of course, be familiar to just about everybody in this room. He was, of course, a towering figure in moral philosophy, both in Oxford and also globally. Parfit, as you all know, sadly passed away just a couple of years ago, in fact, just about 1 year before GPI was formed. So sadly, the life of Parfit and the life of GPI didn't overlap. If he had lived a little bit longer, he would have been a very natural collaborator for GPI, since he himself was very sympathetic to the enterprise of effective altruism. But in any case, we have the honour of presenting this Memorial Lecture series in his name. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just say a couple of quick things about logistics. The lecture will run until around about 6 o'clock, then we have a half-an-hour Q&A session. Following that, you're very welcome to join us for drinks, which will be served just around the corner in the common room area. And then tomorrow we have a follow-up, more extended discussion session from 3 till 4 p.m. That will be in Seminar Room E, also in this building, just one floor up. And in particular, if there are graduate students here who would like to explore the issues at a more leisurely pace, with Lara, you're strongly encouraged to come to that session tomorrow as well as to today's Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado then, this year we're delighted to welcome Professor Lara Buchak to deliver the first annual Parfit Memorial Lecture. Lara is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of California in Berkeley. Her primary research interests are in decision theory, game theory, and rational choice theory. Her 2013 book, Risk and Rationality, concerns how an individual ought to take risk into account when making decisions. And unlike standard Bayesian accounts, which tend to draw a sharp extensional separation between what the ideally rational person does on the one hand when dealing with risk and what real people with all their foibles do on the other hand, the approach that Lara prefers tends to vindicate the ordinary decision maker, even from the point of view of ideal rationality, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that in today's talk. Lara also has quite a diverse array of research interests. Beyond that, these include in the philosophy of religion, in ethics, and in epistemology. Among other things, she's written on distributive justice, on the relationship between partial and full belief, on issues of optimal stopping, and on the nature of faith. Her title today will be Should Effective Altruism Focus on Global Health or Existential Threats? Please join me in welcoming her.
Great, well, thanks. So can everyone hear me? Raise your hand if you can't hear me. I guess that's a slightly odd instruction, but if you think someone can't hear me, raise your hand. So thanks so much for having me. Thanks both to the Global Priorities Institute and especially to Derek Parfit, in whose memory this lecture is given. Unfortunately, I never had the honor to meet him or talk with him, but his work has been incredibly influential within my discipline, within ethics more generally. And I think the sort of questions he was asking, the things he cared about, what should we do, what should our life be about, are the kinds of questions that really animate me as well. So hopefully this lecture will somewhat do him justice. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the general question of how should risk and uncertainty affect our charitable giving. This lecture is going to have 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk both conceptually and formally about how to think both about risk aversion and its counterpart, risk-seeking, and uncertainty aversion and its counterpart, uncertainty-seeking. Next, I'm going to apply that framework to 2 different questions that effective altruists have been interested in. First, the question of should we diversify in our charitable giving? So if we have a fixed amount of money to give, should I give it all to one charity, maybe whatever charity I think is the best in some respect, or should I try to divide it among a number of charities? So that's the second part. Third part, another question that animates effective altruists, namely when I'm choosing between giving to causes or programs that seek to reduce existential risk, roughly programs that have a very small and sometimes unknown probability of making a really big difference. So when I'm choosing between giving to those on the one hand, and on the other hand, giving to causes like health amelioration programs that generally have a really high and known probability of doing some amount of good that, while important, sort of pales in comparison to the amount of good done by the existential risk reduction programs if successful. So in both of these questions, I'm going to talk about how our attitudes towards risk and uncertainty affect how we should answer these questions. And then finally, so far, I will have just given a sort of, if we have these attitudes, here's what we should do, but as ethicists, we care about something else, namely, which attitudes should we have when it comes to moral decision making? So I'm going to argue that when we're making our moral decisions, we should have a particular attitude towards risk, and we should have a particular attitude towards uncertainty, and these are the attitudes that should guide our charitable giving. Okay, and I should say, I realize there's somewhat of a mixed audience here, so there are ethicists that are maybe like a little bit familiar with formal material, but don't love it, and then on the other hand, there are like economists for whom all the formal material might be completely old hat. So I'm going to try to split the difference and explain things in such a way that if you don't have a background in this, you should be able to follow. I think what's important here today is more like the conceptual points than the particular mathematical formalisms that are going to be behind them. So, if you look at the handout and you're like, equations, I hate that, I'm going to sort of try to explain things in a more informal way as well. Okay, so just to start, there's a standard theory of decision making, and then there are 2 variants on it. One allowing for different attitudes towards risk. This is the one, as Hillary mentioned, I've been arguing for, and one allowing for a range of attitudes towards certainty. Okay, so let's say we have, so I'll just sort of briefly explain the standard theory and then the modifications we might make to it. So let's say we have, is this working? Okay, so we have some gamble, and a gamble just says what happens and how good that thing is under certain states of the world or possibilities. So here we have 3 possibilities, E, F, and G, and here we have a gamble that yields some consequence of utility value 1 if E happens, some consequence of utility value 2 if F happens, and some consequence of utility value 3 if G happens. We can put this on a graph, and the expected utility of this gamble is just going to be the area under the curve. And according to the standard theory, rational people maximize expected utility. So they pick the gamble that has the highest area under the curve. And the way to sort of conceptually think about this is, okay, look, this gamble has 3 possibilities. Possibility 1, it yields something of utility 1. Possibility 2, it yields something of utility 2. Possibility 3, it yields something of utility 3. We want to figure out how these possibilities come together to yield a single value for the gamble, and we say, how valuable is each of these possibilities? Its utility value. How much does that utility value count towards the overall value of the gamble? Well, that counts by as much as the probability that you'll get that. So you're going to get something of utility value 2 with probability 1/3. The contribution that makes to the value of the gamble is 1/3 times that total value. Okay, so that's the standard theory. Now, there's another way to think about what this theory says, and that'll sort of set the stage for why I think this theory doesn't actually fully describe rationality. So we've, side by side. So I've sort of been talking about, well, there are 3 considerations in this gamble. You might get 1, you might get 2, you might get 3. But another way to think about what this gamble says is that there are 3 considerations of the following form. For sure, you'll get 1. There's some probability, in this case 2/3, that you'll get another 1 util. And finally, there's some probability, namely 1/3, that you'll get an additional util beyond the other 2. And again, what expected utility maximization says is the weight that each of these considerations gets in your decision making has got to be its probability. So you get 1, probability 1. I might get an additional 1 with probability 2/3. I might get an additional 1 with probability 1. But I say that doesn't follow from what instrumental rationality is supposed to be. So instrumental rationality is supposed to tell us how to take the means to our ends. If we care about things to a certain degree, and we know various actions are make those things happen with certain probability, what should we do? And I say, just from knowing those two facts, we haven't got the answer yet. So just from knowing what utility you assign to consequences and what probability you assign to getting each of these consequences doesn't tell us what you should do. Why? Because there are a variety of rational ways to take these 3 considerations into account in your decision making. For example, you might say, gosh, I'm just really concerned with how well things go if things turn out pretty poorly. So it matters a lot to me that I'm going to get 1 util here. Now this 2/3 chance that I'll get an additional util, that matters to me, just not as much. So we can sort of think, the weight I give to this is not as much weight as its probability value would suggest. And the chance of getting this final util with probability 1/3, that matters to me too. It makes the gamble much better, but things that only happen in some of the best states, I just don't care about that much. So the weight of this consideration shrinks considerably. And we can sort of look at the new area under the curve, call this the risk-weighted expected utility of the gamble for a person that's averse to risk. Or conversely, you might say, I really love risk. In fact, the chance of getting 3 from this gamble, it's a really good making feature of that gamble. That means a lot to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this gamble is worth proportionally more than its probability value would suggest. So maybe I weight it this much. And this one is worth proportionally more too. So maybe I weight it this much. So the basic idea here is that just as your utility and probability function are things you need to know when figuring out what to do, you also have to know the width of these boxes. Which is to say, you have to know how important the top P portion of outcomes are to you when you make decisions. So are you the kind of person that places more value on worst cases and not a lot of value on, say, what happens in the top 10% of states? Or are you the kind of person that places not that much value on things that only happen in worse states, but a lot of value on things that happen in better states? So that's sort of the basic conceptual idea behind the theory here. There are three things involved in choice. A utility function, which measures how much you like various consequences. A probability function, which measures how likely these consequences are to obtain. And a risk function, which measures how much you care about the top p portion of outcomes in decision making. And we can think of this risk function in one of two ways. We can think of it as the way you make trade-offs between your worst off future selves and your best off future selves. So maybe you care a lot more about what happens to your worst off future selves than what happens to your best off future selves, or vice versa. My claim, either way of doing these things, totally fine, and we need to know how you do it in order to figure out what decision you should make. Another way to think about your risk attitudes here, what I would call the risk function is just sort of like how much these boxes get stretched or shrunk relative to their probability, so it's just given by R of P. Another way to think about the risk function is as a trade-off between two virtues of practical rationality. So on the one hand, we have the virtue of prudence, making sure that no matter what, things don't go too badly. On the other hand, we have the virtue of venturesomeness, making sure there's some chance that things go really, really well. And I say, it's up to you how to trade these two things off. Or at the very least, there's a wide range of ways you can do it. Okay. And so we can characterize what it is to be risk avoidant, risk inclined, or risk neutral, or globally neutral. So the risk avoidant person has a convex risk function. That means these boxes shrink more and more as they concern smaller and smaller amounts of probability, or another way to put that, as the good thing happens in a smaller and smaller portion of states, you care about it less and less. And a risk-inclined person, on the other hand, has a concave risk function, which is to say these boxes get stretched, and they get stretched proportionally more and more as probabilities get smaller and smaller. So as things happen, as the good thing happens in a smaller and smaller portion of states, you care about it more and more. Or, of course, we have the globally neutral person, that's just the expected utility maximizer, for whom the width of these boxes is just their probabilities. Another way to think about what the risk-avoidant person is doing invokes the notion of a mean-preserving spread. Just to sort of explain what this means. So here we have some gamble, quote-unquote gamble, that just gives you utility 2 no matter what. We could spread the probability out by preserving the mean. So for example, we could take equal sizes of this probability mass and move some to utility 1 and some to utility 3 so that we get this gamble that's an equal chance of 1, 2, and 3. That's called a mean preserving spread. It preserves the mean while spreading the utility out. If you're averse to risk, you don't like that. You'd rather utility be less spread out among the mean, more concentrated towards the mean. So having a convex risk function is just equivalent to not liking mean preserving spreads. So whichever way, it's sort of conceptually easier for you to think about it. You don't like spreading utility out, or you don't care about utility that sort of only obtains in the best states as much as you care about the worst states. Both are sort of equivalent ways of thinking about it. Finally, I want to mention a distinction that philosophers make between rational decisions and reasonable decisions. So according to expected utility maximization and my modification, risk-weighted expected utility maximization, any values of these functions are permissible as long as they're consistent with each other. So that's what decision theorists think. They say you can have any utility function you want as long as you don't simultaneously like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla and also like vanilla better than chocolate. The only constraints are constraints of consistency. Similarly, you can have any probability and risk function you want, as long as they're consistent. So that's sort of what decision theorists say. Ethicists and epistemologists don't say this. They want to think there's something wrong with some of these assignments. So one way to put this is in terms of the distinction between what's rational in the sense of consistency and what's reasonable in the sense of actually mapping on to the entities in the world we care about. So ethicists are going to want to say, no, not all utility functions are okay, because it's not okay to prefer that somebody else dies to that you scratch your finger. That's just not a moral preference. So the utility function is going to be constrained by what the good is. Similarly, the probability function is going to be constrained by, say, what scientists actually discover about the world. And the risk function, importantly for us, is going to be constrained by which trade-offs between the relevant virtues are not just consistent, but are also reasonable. So we might think, yeah, it's just unreasonable to put all the weight on prudence and none on venturesomeness, so that, for example, you're never willing to cross the street because of the possibility of getting hit by a car. We also might think, not that reasonable to jump out of an airplane with a homemade parachute. It's just putting a little too much weight on venturesomeness, not as enough on prudence. But within the sort of, but there is going to be sort of a range of allowable attitudes, such that some people who are more prudent and some people who are more venturesome are both going to count as reasonable. Okay, so that's risk aversion and risk inclination. There's another phenomenon that's going to be important to us. So far we've been talking about cases in which you know or can reasonably assign probabilities to the various possibilities, but often the world isn't like this. So for example, if I'm offering you this gamble that has 3 possible outcomes, you might be sure that E, F, and G each have probability 1/3, but you also might not know. You might think, there's like a range of probabilities I can assign. So, maybe F actually, or maybe E actually has a much lower probability. Maybe it has a much higher probability. So the boundaries here of E and F, this is going to be a range. We kind of don't know what the true probability is within the range. And similarly, the boundary between F and G is going to be a range. Okay, so that means like this might be the right possible graph, this might be the right possible graph, and so forth. So what should I do when I'm uncertain? Well, I actually don't have a view about rationality. As you'll see later, I do have a view about morality. But let's assume for the minute that lots of ways of approaching this gamble are rational and lots of them are actually reasonable as well. How should we think about this? Well, one popular way to think about this is this thing called the Alpha-Hurwitz criteria. And what that says is just, look, think about 2 possibilities. There's the sort of pessimistic possibility where this gamble has the worst expected utility it might have. So in this case, it's this possibility where the worst case is as big as possible and the best case is as small as possible. Okay, so that's one possibility, the pessimistic possibility. Now think about the optimistic possibility. That's the possibility in which this gamble has the most expected utility it might have. So that's the one in which the probability of G is largest, the probability of E is smallest. So we have the optimistic possibility and the pessimistic possibility. Now, just sort of assign some weight to each of these possibilities and average them together. So if you assign more weight to the pessimistic possibility, you're going to count as uncertainty averse. You don't like uncertainty because you think, in cases of uncertainty, I'm going to go with pessimism. I'm going to be like, think it's a little more likely to be the worst, the probability distribution that's worse for me than the one that's best for me. On the other hand, if you assign more weight to the best distribution, you're going to count as uncertainty seeking. So you're going to be a little optimistic. You're going to think, look, of the two distributions, the one which has the worst overall value for me and the best overall value for me, I'm going to assign a little more weight to it being the best overall value. If you're uncertainty neutral, then you're going to give each of these distributions equal weight. Now I should mention that for our purposes, so there's sort of an additional concept that's slightly different from uncertainty neutral, and that's no uncertainty, or more sort of apt, resolving the uncertainty before you make the decision. So you might make the decision, for example, by first picking the middle probability, and then just treating it like it's the original. It's a gamble with known probabilities. In our examples, because they only involve two possible outcomes and the probability distributions aren't that complex, uncertainty neutral and there being no uncertainty are going to come to the same thing, but they might not always. So I just want to give you a heads up that those things are slightly different. Okay. We can, of course, also apply, take both these things into account at once. So here we just think about the uncertainty. So these probability distributions are really a range. We apply the risk attitude to each of the members, to sort of each side of the range, and then we take the worst possible risk-weighted expected utility, give it some weight, and the best possible risk-weighted expected utility, give it some weight. So we can have any combination of these two attitudes. We can be risk avoidant but uncertainty seeking. We can be risk avoidant and uncertainty averse, and so we can be neutral about one and seeking and the other. They're sort of independent. One is about what you do with the probabilities when you have a range of probabilities and you're not sure where the true probability falls. And the other is about how much to take a possibility with a certain probability into account. So the first is sort of like the epistemic question, what probability should I use for decision making? And the second is the practical question, how should this probability factor into my decision? All right. So that is that's like the theoretical part of the talk. That's sort of like all you need to know about these two different concepts, risk avoidance and uncertainty aversion. Now what we're going to do is apply these concepts to two important questions in effective altruism. And the first is the question of, should I give all my money to one charity, or should I diversify it over a number of charities? And this is sometimes mentioned as a little bit of a puzzle when economists, for example, talk about charitable giving, because it looks like if you maximize expected utility, that is, if you're both risk neutral and think that there's no uncertainty, then it looks like you shouldn't normally diversify over charities. Why? Because there are two possible reasons that expected utility maximization is going to acknowledge for diversifying over charities. One is this idea of diminishing marginal utility, which is to say that if I give $100 to one charity, then giving 100 more will make less of an impact than that first $100. So that's one reason someone might want to diversify in general. However, that just doesn't seem true of the charity types that effective altruists are interested in. Why? Because these are charities that save lives. And these are charities where a given amount of money can reliably save a certain number of lives. So in order to like this explanation, you have to, for example, think like, once I've saved 100 lives, it doesn't matter as much that I save 100 more. But most effective altruists, most ethicists, don't think that. They don't think that utility diminishes marginally in number of lives saved. So this would be an explanation for charitable diversification that isn't going to work. The other reason an expected utility maximizer might diversify over charities is they might think that once they give a certain amount of money, the probability of making a difference goes down. So this might be true in the case of say like a project where what the project is trying to do is, I don't know, find a cure for some particular disease or create a rocket that can go to Mars and sustain life there. If you think after each little bit of money, the sort of first little bit of money really increases the probability of this project being successful, but once you give more, it increases the probability less and less, then you're going to want to diversify. You're going to want to give like a little bit of money to get each of these projects probabilistically off the ground. However, this explanation is only going to work for very specific things. It doesn't look like it can be the right explanation for things like health charities, where we basically, again, know that we can save a certain number of lives if we just give a certain amount of money. So again, lives saved is linear in money. And it looks like these are the kind of charities that most people do in fact diversify over. So what's happening? It looks like people are not being expected utility maximizers here. So can risk avoidance in the sense I'm talking about, or uncertainty aversion in the sense I'm talking about, explain why individuals might diversify? Can it give us a reason to diversify? So let's start with risk avoidance. And just a simple setup here. Let's say you have $2 to distribute and two charities, A and B. You're not sure whether giving $1 to A will increase the utility in the world by 1 or 3, and similarly for B. So you have a little bit of uncertainty over what the outcome is going to be, but again, you know that utility is linear in money. And maybe this uncertainty comes from some empirical uncertainty. You don't know how effective the particular charity is. Maybe it comes from normative uncertainty, so you don't actually know how good some particular consequence is. You think it might be good by utility 1, it might be good by utility 3. So let's say we have, again, you can give $1. Here's giving $1 to each of these charities. Giving $1 to A will increase the status quo by 1 by utility 1, and giving $1 or it will increase the utility of status quo by 3, and similarly with B. And there's some event that'll determine whether it increases the status quo by 1 or 3. So again, the event might be, in fact, this charity really is helpful at saving lives. It saves 3 lives instead of 1 for each $1. Or it might be some normative uncertainty, like, in fact, this the ameliorating of people's health by this type of intervention sort of increases the moral goodness in the world by 3 instead of 1. Okay, so now you face a choice, again, between giving $2 to both charity and giving $1 to each. So you face kind of the following choice, sort of betting on A being successful by putting $2 there. That means you're either going to increase the good in the world by 2 or 6. Betting that B increases betting that B is the thing that gives you utility 3, again, either increasing the utility in the world by 2 or 6, or giving $1 to each and hedging your bets. So, if both A and B are successful, you'll increase the utility of the world by 6. If neither is successful, by 2. But if one is successful and the other isn't, you'll increase the utility in the world by 4. Notice, by the way, that an expected utility maximizer should just give $2 to whatever charity has the highest expected utility. And if the probability of success of each charity is the same, they should be totally indifferent about which of these 3 options they take. Okay. Well, what about the person who avoids risk? Well, let's just start with the simple case in which the probabilities of success are the same. It turns out that for the risk-avoidant person, this option is better. They should diversify over their charitable giving. There are 2 ways to see this. One, again, sort of look at the other way of thinking about utility, where we sort of shrink the weight of these events that are uncertain. Things with this probability are going to get shrunk by a lot more than things with this probability, which is very high. Say this gets shrunk a lot. So the overall area under the curve, again, for the risk-avoidant person, is going to be much smaller in these above examples. And again, that's because the risk-avoidant person says, oh, something that only happens if E obtains, or only happens if F obtains, that weighs a lot less in my decision than something that will happen if either one of them obtains. Okay, so that's one way to see why the risk-avoidant person is going to prefer to diversify. Another way to see why the risk-avoidant person is going to diversify is, again, by thinking about this idea of a mean-preserving spread. So this is a probability utility graph of giving $2 to the one charity. If instead I diversify, what does that mean? Well, I take some of the utility from here and some of the utility from here, and I instead put it in the middle. So I hedge my bets in both a good and a bad way. I think, well, if one of the events obtains and the other doesn't, I want to get 4 rather than 2, even if that means not getting 6 if they both obtain. So diversifying is a mean-preserving spread of just giving all your money to one. So a risk-avoidant person doesn't like it. Okay. So this is also going to hold, by the way, if the charities aren't exactly equal in terms of their mean utility or expected utility. It's also going to hold if B is just a little bit worse, either because B has a lower probability of being successful, or B, if successful, will not quite be as successful as A, if successful. In other words, this reasoning doesn't depend on the 2 charities being sort of exactly as good from an expected utility perspective. We can sort of see this by noticing that giving $1 to A and $1 to B is strictly better than giving $2 to one or the other. So you'd be willing to sort of like lose a little bit of money in order to do that. So, you know, giving, say, $1 to A and 70 cents to B might still be a little better than giving $1 to each of those charities. And if that's true, then there's going to be some wiggle room, so you can make A a little bit worse, and the amount of money you arbitrage like a little bit less. The result would still hold. Okay. Now, by the way, this assumes that E and F are not perfectly correlated. In other words, it assumes that A being successful doesn't mean that B is successful too. So if they're both sort of like a bet on the same event, then taking 2 copies of A is going to be just as good as taking 2 copies of B. Why? Because in that case, it's just literally the same gamble, described in a different way. So you're going to want to hedge across charities whose success depends on different facts. For example, I don't know, let's say you're not sure which normative theory is correct. You're not sure, for example, I don't know, if it's better to improve people's health during their lives, or if it's better to improve the length of the life, even with slightly less health. You're like, I don't know, some normative theories say the one, some say the other. Then you're best off giving some money to a charity that does this, and some money to a charity that does this, rather than putting all of your eggs in one basket. That is, if you're risk avoidant. Of course, if you're risk inclined, it's going to be better to put all your eggs in one basket, and it's going to be better to put all your eggs in one basket, even if it's maybe you sort of think, even if it like costs you some money to do something. Okay. So now, important caveat, the reasoning that I've just given is only valid if the status quo is not a gamble itself, or if the relevant choices, giving twice to A or once to A and once to B, aren't equally risky relative to the status quo. And a way to think about this is so say the status quo isn't just, hey, we know how things in the world are. Say the status quo is like, we don't know whether there's a specific disease that will make people's lives even worse than they are now in some country. That disease might, I don't know, say the flu might hit and really affect people's lives. We don't know whether that's true. If we're in a situation like that, then one of the gambles might sort of count as insurance relative to the status quo. So in that situation, for example, the gamble where we ameliorated health is sort of like hedging your bets against the status quo. Or on the other hand, if we know that in the status quo, everybody else is giving their money to A, then giving all my money to B is actually buying insurance against the status quo plus what everybody else is doing. So this is to say that what we want is diversification from effective altruists as a whole. It's not important to have diversification for individual effective altruists, although under some plausible assumptions, it also will be. So for example, if you just like have no idea what everybody else is giving to, it might be plausible to give to the status quo. And it will, I know Christian Tierney has a paper about this, it will be important actually sort of like how spread out the status quo is, because if the status quo looks like it contains lots of really good and lots of really bad, and what you do no longer is going, and diversification is no longer going to look like insurance relative to that sort of strange status quo, then you're no longer going to want to diversify. You're going to be indifferent. So again, the idea is like, insofar as diversification looks like buying insurance against being wrong about the effectiveness of one of the gambles, it's going to be a good thing. Insofar as diversification doesn't have that property, insofar as it sort of like doesn't amount to hedging your bets, it's not going to look good. Okay. So what if you're uncertainty avoidant? What should you do? Okay. So remember, again, the uncertainty avoidant person, when they're thinking about these two gambles, they're going to notice, they're going to be like, I don't know, P probably has some probability between 0.25 and 0.75, but I don't know what it is. So there's sort of a range of probabilities this could be. And similarly for F here. I don't know where things are in this range. And let's assume that the probability of E is somewhere in 0.25, 0.75, and so is the probability of F. Okay. Now, expected utility maximization has this nice property where as long as the utilities are additive, we can just sort of figure out the utility of each gamble by itself and add them up to get the utility of taking both, which is sort of also an easy way to see why taking 2 copies of A for the expected utility maximizer is just as good as taking 2 copies of B. So we can exploit that fact to think about how the person who doesn't like uncertainty will think about these gambles. Well, they'll think the minimum value of each of these gambles is the value calculated using a probability of 0.25. So these gambles actually amount to the same gamble. So it sort of doesn't, and the maximum is going to be the same. So it actually doesn't matter whether I diversify or not. However, if we have probabilities in these ranges, but we know that the probabilities are somewhat anti-correlated, which means if we know that the probability of E is going to be a little higher, just in case the probability of F is a little lower, then you are going to want to diversify. So if, for example, again, you thought that whether A is successful is going to depend on whether B is successful in an anti-correlated way, A is more likely to be successful if B is more likely to be unsuccessful, maybe because they're based on opposite moral assessments, maybe because they're based on incompatible empirical assessments, then the worst value of 2A is still going to be calculated using this worst probability, but the worst value of A plus B is calculated by taking the worst probability of A plus something that's not the worst probability of B, because they can't both have their worst probability at the same time. And similarly for the maximum. So therefore, the uncertainty-averse person, if these probabilities are even a little anti-correlated, they're going to want to diversify as well. So we have a similar result as we had for the risk-avoiding person. Again, this is only going to be true if the status quo is not itself probabilistically uncertain. So if taking one of these gambles, for example, is actually going to reduce the uncertainty in the world, maybe by hedging against something that's already there, that's already uncertain, then you're going to want to take it. But if the status quo is not probabilistically uncertain, or if it is, but A and B don't resolve that uncertainty differently, then if you know that most people are taking A, you should take multiple copies of B and vice versa. And again, effective altruists as a whole should try to diversify over the, or at least uncertainty-averse effective altruists as a whole should try to diversify over the gambles they take. Okay. So that's diversification. Both the risk avoidant and the uncertainty averse effective altruist should diversify under certain, at least somewhat plausible assumptions. Okay. So next I'm going to talk about the choice between programs like health programs that have effects that are fairly known, whose probabilities are known, maybe the effects are fairly well known, and on the other hand, existential risk reduction programs. Existential risk reduction programs, again, are programs where they bring about a small change in a probability of something that has massively good value or massively bad value, but we're not exactly sure of the size of change we bring about. So an example of a health program is something like buying mosquito nets for people in areas where there's a malaria problem. We know that with very high probability, that saves lives. There are actually two types of existential risk reduction programs, or at least two ways to think about existential risk. So some of these programs could be thought of in one way or the other. One program we might call existential insurance. So we're buying existential insurance when we have, we know some massively bad event might happen, but its probability is small. Existential insurance is a program that lowers the chance of that massively bad event, or makes things not so bad if that event comes to pass. For example, preventing bee extinction is like this. Preventing catastrophic global warming is like this, so maybe there's a small chance of catastrophic global warming. We could embark on a program that will lower the chance of catastrophic global warming or make things not so bad for humanity if we do have catastrophic global warming. Similarly, programs that seek to reduce the chance of nuclear war are like this. So there's a small probability of nuclear war. It would be really bad if that happened. Programs that try to make that chance smaller count as existential insurance programs. We also have programs that we might call existential lottery tickets. So with an existential lottery ticket, the setup is that the probability of a massively bad, or at least not good relative to the thing you're buying the lottery for, is close to certainty. An existential lottery ticket lowers the chance of a massively bad event, or in other words, raises the small probability of a good event. So something like colonizing other galaxies is like this. In the absence of programs to do that, the chance of colonizing other galaxies is very, very small. But if we buy the existential lottery ticket, or to buy the existential lottery ticket is try to increase the probability that we will successfully colonize other galaxies. The transhumanist project is like this. There's like a small chance that we can outlive our natural deaths or become the kind of species that is immortal, but transhumanist programs try to raise the small probability of this happening. Maybe raising the probability of various religious possibilities here in the afterlife is like this. You might think there's a very small chance that some religious possibility is true, but if we raise the chance of it being true or raise the chance of people doing the thing they need to do, so Pascal's wager is sort of an example of this, then we're buying an existential lottery ticket. So now we want to know, how do risk avoidance or inclination and uncertainty avoidance or uncertainty seeking affect the value of existential insurance and existential lottery tickets relative to the value of health programs? And we're going to, so what we're going to do is we're going to assume that all three of these programs to begin with have the same expected utility, and then we're going to say, if we add in one of these attitudes, risk avoidance, risk inclination, and so forth, what changes, which programs get better and which programs get worse. I mean, I want to flag that built into this kind of setup is the assumption that the consequences aren't infinitely good or infinitely bad. Because if you think that, say, the consequences of existential, of the thing you're buying existential insurance against are infinitely bad, or you think that the consequences of the thing you're buying the existential lottery ticket for are infinitely good, then it's not going to matter what probabilities we assign to those. The existential lottery ticket is always going to be better than health programs and worse than, and the existential insurance is always going to be also better health programs. But, so, just a word about whether this assumption might be plausible. I know some long-termists do think it's like infinitely valuable to, for humanity to go on forever, and merely finitely valuable any way of humanity not going on forever. If you think that, then we could just assume we're talking about the value of each of these things within a particular time frame. So you could ask, like, at any particular time, in the time leading up to it, is it better to have bought the existential lottery ticket? Is it better to have bought the existential insurance? Or is it better to have paid into the health program? Okay. So let's just assume, making some assumptions that make all these things start with the same expected utility. So the status quo is like, there's some little chance of a bad thing happening, nuclear war, say, environmental catastrophe. That has utility negative 200. Probably the neutral thing will happen. That's what's happening now. Humanity's still alive. Lots of people pretty badly off. There's also some possibility of the good thing happening, human immortality, colonizing other galaxies, whatever it is. That's the status quo. Here's what each of these things do. Health programs, I'm just going to assume health program has like a known utility, like with probability 1 it helps by this utility. It's not going to matter to the sort of eventual analysis. Health programs just increase all these possibilities by utility 2. So everyone gets a little health boost, or the people that need it get a little health boost, so that no matter what, the world goes a little bit better before we all die or before we successfully colonize other galaxies and become immortal. Okay. Existential insurance, on the other hand, lowers the probability of this bad thing by some tiny amount. So it sort of like shifts some probability here to the neutral state. And the existential lottery ticket shifts some probability to the neutral state to the probability of the good state. From the point of view of expected utility maximization, these are all equal. Because what I've done is I've added 2 utiles to this entire graph, spread out in one way or another. The health program just sort of added it all everywhere. The existential insurance added it all here. The existential lottery ticket added it all here. Okay, so the EU maximizer is going to find each of these programs equally good. What about the person who avoids risk? Well, for the person who avoids risk, the existential insurance is going to get better. Why? Because I'm adding the 2 utiles to a worse state, and worse states get more weight. And the existential lottery is going to get worse. Why? Because I'm adding those 2 utiles to the best state, and the best state matters less to me. The risk avoidance is going to prefer the existential insurance to the health program to the existential lottery. And of course, the risk-seeking person is going to have just the opposite preferences. They care more about what happens in best states than worst states, so they're going to want to do the programs that increase the probability of the really good thing happening, rather than the programs that decrease the probability of the really bad thing happening, or increase the probability of the neutral thing rather than the bad thing happening. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. What about uncertainty aversion? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the way to sort of think about this is health programs, not a lot of uncertainty involved about the probabilities, but these existential insurance and lottery ticket gambles, lots of uncertainty involved. So we can sort of think that in this case, you're changing the probability of the bad thing in the case of existential insurance, or the good thing in the case of the existential lottery, by some unknown amount. Instead of changing it by 1%, you might be changing it by 0. You might be having no effect at all. On the other hand, more optimistically, maybe you're changing it by 2%. Okay, so again, the way to sort of think about this graphically is these are actually intervals of unknown size. And we want to calculate the expected utility relative to these intervals. So what adding uncertainty aversion is going to do is to make both existential insurance and the existential lottery worse. I mean, I suppose once you say it, it becomes pretty obvious because the existential insurance and the existential lottery involve uncertainty, whereas the health programs don't. So if they're equal in terms of expected utility, and then you say, well, existential insurance and the existential lottery might have worse expected utility, they might have better. We weigh the worst expected utility more heavily, those things are going to get worse. And for the uncertainty seeker, things go in the opposite direction. Both the existential lottery and the existential insurance get better than the health programs. Okay. Now we can also sort of consider what happens when you have both uncertainty aversion and risk avoidance, or any combination of these things. And I won't go through all of the boxes here. The way to think about this is, let me just mention, for example, if you're risk avoidant and uncertainty averse, which is like what most people are, then one of two things happens. Well, we know the existential lottery is the worst because it's the worst for the risk avoidant person, and it's one of the worst things for the uncertainty averse person. Whether the existential insurance is better or worse than the health program is going to depend on whether the risk of avoidance is more operative or the uncertainty aversion is more operative. So if you're like really, really, really risk avoidant, but not that uncertainty avoidant, then the existential insurance is going to be better. But if you're sort of only mildly risk avoidant, but very uncertainty avoidant, then the health program is going to be better. And so you can sort of, just go through and think conceptually about why what's in the boxes is going to describe the preferences of people with those attitudes. And of course, combining the sort of last section with this section, we actually face a more complicated choice. We might ask whether we ought to diversify over these lotteries, so whether I have to give some money to the existential lottery and some money to global health programs, for example. And the answer is, like, as long as you have some degree of risk avoidance or uncertainty avoidance, diversification is going to look a little bit better. Maybe not that much better, so it might be that you shouldn't go 50-50, but like you should give lots of money for existential insurance and like $1 to global health programs or something. Okay. All right. A little mental stretch. Okay. So that's the end of the discussion of what these different attitudes are going to tell us to do in the case of charitable giving. But there's a really, really important question for ethicists, and that's, which of these attitudes should we have? Sure, you're telling me, yeah, here's a range of attitudes I could have, and they each tell me to do different things. Great, but what should I do? Okay, I think this is a really important question. This is a question that hasn't been talked about a lot in philosophy primarily because philosophers, when they sort of use these formal models at all, use expected utility maximization rather than one of these other variants. So what I want to do is sort of start the discussion. I have some views. I'm going to argue for those views, but this is also like the beginning of the discussion, so this is a part that I'm particularly interested in your questions and feedback and pushback. No, I think those are the wrong moral principles. This is something that we, anyone who's sort of interested in what's the most effective way to give, really has to think about. Okay, so should we be risk avoidant about moral decisions? By we, I mean, as a whole, people who are concerned about doing the most good with their charitable giving. Okay, so I think in the case of risk, the answer is we should be maximally risk avoidant within reason. So if there were a range of reasonable risk attitudes that the individual might adopt for self-interested decisions, then as a group, we've got to adopt the most risk avoidant of those attitudes. So why? Well, so I've argued elsewhere for this principle I call the risk principle, and I'll briefly go through the sort of several arguments for it. So here's the principle. When making a decision for an individual, choose under the assumption that he has the most risk-avoidant attitude within reason, unless we know that he has a different risk attitude, in which case, choose using his risk attitude. So I'll sort of explain why I think this is the right moral principle, then explain how it applies to the decision for a group of people. The key thing to draw from this moral principle is that there is a real default when we're thinking about risk attitudes, and risk avoidance is the default. For example, risk neutrality is not the default. I don't know, the risk attitude that the typical person has is not the default. Okay. So a couple arguments for this principle. First, an argument from examples about not just how we do take moral risks, but how we think we ought to take moral risks when they involve another person and not us. So imagine you're playing basketball with an acquaintance, he hurts his shoulder and is in moderate pain. You don't know whether it's a muscle spasm or a pulled muscle. Imagine these possibilities are equally likely, just to make things simpler. You could either apply heat or ice. Heat will really help if it's a muscle spasm, but actually putting heat on a pulled muscle leads to intense pain. On the other hand, ice will sort of not be that bad. It'll do nothing for a muscle spasm, but it'll provide mild relief for a pulled muscle. So we have this gamble. What I submit is that you might do either thing in your own case. You might sort of think, yeah, I really care about I just really care that I might be in intense pain, I want to avoid that. Or you might think, look, the possibility of relief is going to weigh really heavily for me, so perfectly fine to make either decision for yourself. On the other hand, if you don't know what the acquaintance wants, it looks like you ought to apply ice. You can't pick the riskier decision for him without knowing that that's what he would prefer. Why? Because, now here's the sort of second argument. First argument is I submit that we actually do this, and not only do we do this, we think it's the right thing to do. We don't just happen to do this and upon reflection go I don't know, we think, yeah, we can't take risks for other people if they don't know they would consent to them. Why? Because ending up in a relatively worse state requires stronger justification. So just imagine what your acquaintance might say if you end up in the bad case of either of these procedures. Say you applied ice, and it turns out to be a muscle spasm, so he's still in moderate pain, whereas heat would have given him relief. He might say to you, why didn't you apply heat instead? Given that I have a muscle spasm, I would have relief instead of moderate pain. You might say, felicitously, because it might have been a pulled muscle, and then heat would have caused intense pain. That's a justification for your doing the less risky thing. On the other hand, the symmetrical justification is not available to you if you choose to do the riskier thing. Because it looks like he has a complaint if you do the riskier thing, and then it turns out to actually be the bad thing. So say he has a pulled muscle, you put heat on it, ouch, intense pain. He says, why didn't you apply ice instead, given that I have a pulled muscle? I would have mild pain instead of intense pain. I guess we can imagine he's saying this through his pain, forming coherent sentences. And you say, because it might have been a muscle spasm, and then the ice would have caused relief. This doesn't actually seem like a good justification for what you did. Even though you did something that might have turned out really well, you took a risk that he didn't consent to. So it looks like, again, risk avoidance is the default. And finally, it looks like there's some sort of reasonableness standard. So we might say, if no reasonable person would reject an option on the grounds that it is too risky, then we're justified in choosing that option. But if a reasonable person could reject it on those grounds, then we are not justified in choosing it. So it looks like we're only justified in taking a risk for someone else if no reasonable person could reject that risk. Interestingly enough, it looks like there's an asymmetry between rejecting gambles because they're too risky and rejecting gambles because they're not risky enough. So for example, it doesn't look like, so that gamble was too risky for me is a valid complaint against someone who took a risk for you, not knowing what you would want. But that gamble was not risky enough for me is not a valid complaint against someone taking a gamble that was not as risky as you would have wanted. Now notice, by the way, that while it appears that we have a default risk attitude, the same isn't true for the utility function. So for example, if you're buying some ice cream for a friend and you don't know if they like vanilla or chocolate, it seems like there's no grounds on which to make this decision. We don't default to chocolate unless the person wants vanilla, or vice versa. So this is a way in which sort of assessing someone else's utility function is different from using a risk function to make a decision for them. Okay, so what does this mean if you have a lot of people? Well, I'm not going to come down on the side of a particular view of how to aggregate different risk functions, though I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if you want. But I think I can at least say the following weak principle. Risk-averse people's risk attitudes shouldn't count for less than other people's risk attitudes. And also, there are a lot of people in the future. So if you combine these two facts and notice that by the risk principle, we have to assign the future people the default risk attitude, then it looks like when we're making decisions that primarily affect future people, we have to be very, very risk avoidant. As risk avoidant or nearly as risk avoidant as the most reasonable risk avoidant person would be. So that means, again, we're going to be in the left-hand column of this chart on the previous page about what we should do, how we should rank the existential gamble versus the existential lottery versus the existential insurance versus the health program. Okay. So that's risk avoidance. That's at least my sort of initial stab at a moral view about what we should do, what risk attitude we should adopt when we're making decisions for a large group of people. In this case, the future people. So second question, should we be uncertainty averse about moral decisions? And in particular, I'm going to get into this question by asking whether a parallel principle is true in the case of uncertainty, as is true in the case of risk. I'm actually going to argue that it's not. So here's the candidate uncertainty principle. when making a decision for an individual, choose under the assumption that he has the most uncertainty averse, that is the most pessimistic attitude within reason, unless we know that he has a different uncertainty attitude, in which case choose using his uncertainty attitude. Okay, so a couple things to notice. First, it looks like arguments that are parallel to the above arguments about risk don't seem to work. So it doesn't look like there are, in a similar example in which you don't know what the probabilities are, it doesn't look like the person would have cause to complain against you if, say, you used a probability in the middle of the scale rather than the most pessimistic probability. And it looks like, because unlike the asymmetry between too risky and not risky enough, I can complain that you're being too risky, but I can't complain that you're being not risky enough on my behalf. There's no asymmetry between being too pessimistic and too optimistic. So it seems like I can complain about your being too pessimistic to the same extent I can complain about your being too optimistic. So a tentative conclusion here, and again, I'd be interested to hear if anyone has arguments or considerations that they think point either towards we ought to be uncertainty averse or we ought to be uncertainty seeking. But the tentative conclusion is that we should be uncertainty neutral when making moral decisions. And if we try to think about the underlying reasons why we should be risk avoidant but uncertainty neutral, we can recall that uncertainty is epistemic. So it's about which of the sort of set of possible beliefs or set of probability distributions, which one should I use? On the other hand, your attitude towards risk is a practical stance. When I think about which thing I want to see in the world or which strategy I want to take towards realizing my aims, how should I take some of these possible future states into account? That means that uncertainty or ambiguity avoidance is sort of, it's essentially a fact about our belief states or about how our beliefs relate to evidence. It's not a fact about something that's out there in the world and how we should take it into account, whereas risk avoidance is a fact about something out there in the world and how we should take it into account. So that's why these sort of have a different valence. Okay, so that's right. Then when it comes to the existential insurance, the existential lottery, and the health program, we should be in this middle box of the left column. We should think if all these things have the same expected utility, the existential insurance is better than the health program, is better than the existential lottery. Now, of course, it's not going to be the case that these things always have the exact same expected utility, so the conclusion of my talk is not, okay, buy the existential insurance, don't buy the other things. The conclusion is, insofar as when we're making moral decisions, we shouldn't subject future people, to risks that they didn't sign up for or might not sign up for. The existential insurance should look a lot better to us. The existential insurance sort of, that's a consideration that tells in favor of it. So what that means is that the health program has got to be a lot better than the existential insurance in order to justify giving you that instead of the existential insurance. And similarly, the existential lottery, insofar as we ought not to be very risky when it comes to choices that affect future people, the existential lottery is going to, in virtue of that fact, look a lot worse. So we're going to need more justification in terms of its sort of usefulness or its the probability of it being successful in order to justify picking that over the health program or the existential lecture. Okay, so what I've done is talk about a way to think about risk aversion and a way to think about uncertainty aversion. I've applied these characteristics of individuals to the choice about whether to diversify over when I'm giving a charity, and to the choice about which type of charities make the most sense to give to. I've then given at least a tentative argument for which of these attitudes we should adopt when making moral decisions, and concluded that we should be risk avoidant but uncertainty neutral. Right? Thanks very much for listening.